The neighborhood was everything James had wanted: quiet, orderly, and safe. Rows of identical houses lined the pristine streets, each lawn trimmed to perfection, each driveway spotless. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed out of place. And that's exactly why he had chosen it. As an FBI special agent, James had spent years navigating the chaos of undercover operations, high-risk investigations, and dangerous criminals. Now, all he wanted was peace, a place where he and his loyal German shepherd, Rex, could finally live without looking over their shoulders. At first, life in the neighborhood seemed simple. The HOA had its rules. No loud music after 9 p.m., no. Visible trash cans and lawns had to be kept immaculate. Annoying, sure, but nothing James couldn't handle. He wasn't the type to draw attention. He paid his dues, nodded politely to his neighbors, and kept to himself. But then, out of nowhere, the first letter arrived. A crisp white envelope tucked neatly into his mailbox, stamped with the HOA's official seal. He opened it, scanning. The words with growing confusion. Your property is in violation of HOA regulations. Immediate action is required. Your dog does not meet community standards. James frowned, glancing at Rex, who sat beside him with his usual alert but calm expression. Rex wasn't just a pet. He was a trained K9, disciplined and well-behaved. More importantly, nowhere in the HOA's handbook was there a rule against dogs like him. He checked again, flipping through the community guidelines, searching for any mention of breed restrictions or pet limitations. Nothing. So, why was Rex being singled out? Something about this didn't sit right. Shrugging it off as a simple misunderstanding, James decided to clarify the situation. The next day, he walked to the HOA office, a small but overly polished building at the edge of the neighborhood. Inside, a middle-aged woman with a stiff smile and eyes that didn't quite meet his greeted him. Her nameplate read, Karen Whitmore, HOA President. James explained the letter, keeping his tone calm and measured. Karen barely let him finish before cutting him off. It's a new regulation. We've had some concerns from residents about large, aggressive dogs. You understand, I'm sure. James narrowed his eyes. Rex isn't aggressive. He's a trained service dog. There's nothing in the HOA handbook about this. Karen's smile didn't waver, but there was something cold in her expression. Well, perhaps it's time to update the handbook. A slow, sinking feeling settled in James's gut. This wasn't about community rules. This was personal. But what Karen didn't know, what none of them knew, was that James wasn't just any homeowner. He was an investigator by nature, trained to uncover secrets, to see through deception. And something told him this was just the beginning of a much bigger game. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. James had dealt with all kinds of threats in his career. Coded messages from criminals, veiled warnings from mob bosses, even direct threats to his life. But never had he expected his biggest battle to start with a neatly folded letter slipped into his mailbox. It was the second one in just a week. This time, the wording was harsher, more urgent. Final notice. Your dog is in violation of HOA regulations. Non-compliance will result in fines and further action. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Karen Whitmore, HOA President. He exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the paper. Rex sat at his feet, ears twitching. As if sensing his owner's growing frustration, James had done his homework. He had read every single page of the HOA handbook. There were no breed restrictions, no weight limits, no rules about working dogs. Whatever Karen and her board were playing at, it wasn't about regulations. It was something else entirely. Deciding he needed answers, James logged onto the HOA's website, searching for any new amendments. Nothing. No recent updates, no official announcements. If this was a real rule, why wasn't it documented? His instincts, honed from years in law enforcement, told him this wasn't about the dog, it was about control. Someone in the HOA had decided Rex didn't belong, and they were determined to get rid of him by any means necessary. His first move was to confront the HOA directly. He attended the next community meeting, where a dozen homeowners sat in the pristine clubhouse, nodding along to whatever Karen dictated. When it was finally his turn to speak, he held up the letter. "Can someone explain why my dog is suddenly a violation of HOA rules? Because I checked. There's nothing in the guidelines about service dogs, working dogs, or any kind of breed restriction." Karen's lips pressed into a thin smile. "The board has received complaints from concerned residents. Large dogs can be unpredictable. We're simply ensuring a safe environment." James scanned the room, looking for any sign of these so-called concerned residents. No one spoke up. No one even met his gaze. It was as if they were afraid to. "I'd like to see the complaints," he said, keeping his voice level. Karen's smile flickered. "That's confidential HOA business." That was it. The confirmation he needed. There were no complaints. No rules. Just Karen and her cronies pulling strings behind the scenes. James had spent his career uncovering lies, reading people, and exposing hidden motives. This woman might have had the power in this neighborhood, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. Walking out of the meeting, James made a decision. He wasn't going to let this go. If the HOA wanted a fight, they were about to get one. But before he could strike, he needed to know exactly what he was up against. And that meant digging deeper, looking into Karen Whitmore and the HOA's real motives, because something told him this wasn't just about a dog. Something had shifted in the neighborhood. James could feel it, the way people averted their gazes when he walked past, the forced smiles that quickly faded when they thought he wasn't looking. It wasn't just the usual suburban small talk drying up. There was an unease in the air, a quiet tension he couldn't ignore. He had lived in high-stakes situations long enough to recognize when someone was trying to push him out. And now, it wasn't just Karen and the HOA. The entire neighborhood seemed to be turning against him. It started subtly. A neighbor who used to greet him every morning suddenly began rushing inside whenever he stepped out. The friendly couple down the street, who had once given Rex treats over the fence, now pulled their child away when he walked by, whispering something under their breath. He even caught the retired man from across the street peeking through his blinds whenever James left the house, his expression unreadable. Then came the complaints, one after another, slipping into his mailbox like clockwork. Noise violation, dog barking late at night. Leash law infraction, dog seen roaming freely. Property damage, neighbor reports trampled flowers, each one more ridiculous than the last. But there was one glaring problem. None of it was true. James worked long hours, often arriving home late, and Rex was trained to remain quiet unless given a command. He was never off-leash, and as for the flowers, James didn't even know which neighbor had made the complaint. He decided to test a theory. For 2 nights straight, he kept Rex inside, locked up in his home. The dog didn't step paw outside after sunset. Yet, on the 3rd morning, another letter arrived. Excessive noise violation, dog causing disturbances at night. James stared at the paper, his jaw tightening. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. This wasn't about infractions. It was about forcing him out. His instincts screamed at him to dig deeper. The way the neighbors avoided eye contact, the sudden influx of complaints, it all felt coordinated, orchestrated. He had spent years dealing with criminal organizations, undercover networks, and corruption at the highest levels. And right now, his quiet little neighborhood was starting to feel like just another case. The only difference, this time, it was personal. Later that night, as he sat on his porch sipping coffee, he noticed movement at the edge of his property, a shadow, just beyond the streetlight's glow. His muscles tensed as he pretended not to see. Slowly, he reached for his phone, switching to the security app that controlled the cameras he had installed a few days ago. A live feed popped up, showing a hooded figure near his fence, crouching down as if placing something on his lawn. Then, just as quickly, they slipped away into the darkness. James exhaled slowly, his mind racing. This wasn't just harassment anymore. Someone was planting evidence. The silent war had just escalated, and James was ready to fight back. James knew he was being watched. The complaints, the cold stares, the shadowy figure near his fence. It all pointed to something bigger. than a simple HOA dispute. If they wanted to play dirty, so be it. He had spent years in the FBI gathering evidence, piecing together patterns, and catching criminals who thought they were untouchable. The HOA might have had control over the neighborhood, but James controlled his own property. And now, it was time to turn the tables. He installed a network of hidden cameras, small, discreet, and strategically placed. One by the mailbox, another near the fence line, two covering the front and back yards, and an extra one positioned just above the garage. They weren't obvious, but they didn't have to be. All he needed was one mistake, one moment of carelessness, and whoever was behind this would expose themselves. 3 nights passed without incident. The footage showed nothing unusual, just neighbors going about, their routines, some stealing glances at his house, others avoiding it entirely. But on the 4th night, just past 2 a.m., his phone buzzed with an alert. Motion detected. James sat up instantly, his pulse steady, but alert. He tapped into the live feed, and there it was, a hooded figure creeping toward his fence, glancing around nervously before stepping onto his property. James narrowed his eyes. The person moved quickly, reaching into their pocket and pulling out what looked like a small plastic bag. Without hesitation, they bent down, placing it near his porch steps. Then, just as swiftly as they came, they turned and slipped back into the night. James rewound the footage, zooming in on the intruder's face as they glanced toward the streetlight. His jaw tightened. It was one of the HOA board members, a man named Richard Bowen. James recognized him from the meetings, always sitting next to Karen, nodding along with her every word. His mind worked fast. This wasn't just an attempt to intimidate him. They were trying to frame him. If he had to guess, the bag contained something incriminating, maybe contraband, maybe something that would violate HOA rules, maybe even something serious enough to involve law enforcement. But they had made a critical mistake. They assumed James was just another homeowner. They had no idea they were dealing with a federal agent trained to hunt down deception. But James wasn't just interested in Richard. He wanted to know who was really pulling the strings. So he did what he did best. He dug deeper. That night, he ran a background check on Karen Whitmore. It wasn't hard. Most people left traces of their past scattered across public records, old news articles, and forgotten social media accounts. What he found made his blood run cold. Karen Whitmore wasn't just an HOA president. She was a former real estate developer who had been quietly forced out of her last job after multiple allegations of fraud, fake fines, property seizures, illegally rewriting HOA bylaws to push out homeowners and sell their properties at a profit. There were no criminal charges. She had been smart enough to cover her tracks. But the pattern was undeniable. She wasn't just running the HOA. She was running a racket. James leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Now it all made sense. The bogus complaints, the attempts to paint Rex as a dangerous dog, the mysterious complaints appearing out of nowhere. She was trying to force him out, just like she had done to others. But this time, she had picked the wrong target. The HOA thought they were playing a game of power and intimidation. What they didn't realize was that James had already set the board, and it was only a matter of time before he made his next move. James had spent his entire career exposing liars, unearthing secrets, and dismantling criminal operations that thrived in the shadows. He had seen it all: corrupt officials, organized fraud, power-hungry manipulators, but he never expected to find something so sinister hiding beneath the pristine lawns and white picket fences of his own neighborhood. Karen Whitmore wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. She was running a full-scale operation of intimidation, fraud, and property theft. With every late-night search and every background check, the puzzle pieces fell into place. Karen's history stretched back over a decade, a trail of quiet, but calculated destruction. Multiple neighborhoods, the same pattern. She would take control of the HOA, enforce absurd rules, slap homeowners with outrageous fines, and make their lives unbearable. Eventually, they would have no choice but to leave. And when they did, their homes, suspiciously undervalued, would be snapped up by buyers connected to Karen. Sometimes shell companies, sometimes distant relatives, but always with the same result: She profited while families lost everything. James scrolled through old lawsuits and complaints, most of which had been quietly dismissed or buried under bureaucratic red tape. Dozens of homeowners had fought back, but none had won. Some were too exhausted to keep fighting. Others simply disappeared from public record after selling their homes. Karen was careful, meticulous. She never got her hands dirty directly. Instead, she used HOA regulations as her weapon, bending the rules to suit her agenda and wielding fines like a financial noose. It was legal on paper, but morally, it was a scam of the highest order. But this time, she had miscalculated. She wasn't dealing with an ordinary homeowner. She was dealing with an FBI agent trained to dismantle operations just like hers. James knew that evidence was key. What he had so far was enough to raise eyebrows, but not enough to bring her down. He needed more, something undeniable. So he started digging locally. If she had done this before, she had surely left victims in this very neighborhood. One by one, he reached out to neighbors. Those who had been silent, those who had avoided him. At first they hesitated, looking over their shoulders as if afraid they were being watched. But then the floodgates opened. A young couple on the next street had been fined so aggressively for unauthorized landscaping that they had to put their home up for sale. An elderly widow had been threatened with foreclosure over unpaid community maintenance fees that seemed to increase every month. Another family had received mysterious complaints about their teenage son's car being an eyesore, forcing them to move out to avoid further harassment. The pattern was undeniable. Karen didn't enforce rules. She weaponized them. Then came the final piece of the puzzle, something so damning that James knew it would be the key to her downfall. Financial records. A former HOA treasurer who had quietly resigned months earlier finally agreed to talk. With a mix of bitterness and relief, he handed James a folder filled with documents he had been too scared to release. Misallocated funds, inflated expenses, unauthorized transactions. Money that homeowners had paid in fees and fines was being funneled into maintenance projects that didn't exist. Tens of thousands of dollars had simply vanished. James sat back, exhaling slowly. This was bigger than he had imagined. It wasn't just petty HOA abuse. It was fraud. Karen had built an empire on fear and deception. But now, she was standing on a foundation of lies that was about to crumble beneath her. This wasn't just about saving his home or keeping Rex by his side anymore. This was about justice. And James was about to make sure Karen Whitmore finally faced the consequences she had spent years avoiding. James had spent weeks gathering evidence, piecing together the fraudulent empire that Karen Whitmore had built under the guise of neighborhood order. He had enough to bury her in legal trouble, but he wasn't quite ready to make his move. Not yet. First, he wanted to see just how deep the corruption ran, how desperate Karen and her cronies would get once they realized they were being hunted. So, he decided to send a message. The next HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room filled with plastic chairs, a long folding table, and the same handful of board members who had been backing Karen since day one. James arrived right on time, taking his usual seat at the back of the room. The air was tense, thick with unspoken words. Karen avoided looking at him directly, but her fingers drummed against the table. A nervous tick. She knew something was off. She could feel it. As the meeting dragged on with discussions about lawn maintenance and parking restrictions, James finally spoke up. "I do have one concern." His voice was calm, measured. "I've been doing some research on HOA regulations, and more importantly, how they're being enforced in this neighborhood." He pulled out a folder and placed it on his lap, just enough for Karen to notice. A bluff. There were no charges filed yet, but she didn't know that. Karen stiffened. "If you have an issue, you can file a formal complaint like everyone else." Her tone was firm, but James could hear the slight tremor underneath it. He smiled. "Oh, I'll be filing something, but not with the HOA. You see, I work for the FBI. Oui?" Reaction was immediate. A ripple of unease spread through the room. Some of the board members shifted in their seats, their eyes darting toward Karen as if silently questioning whether they had backed the wrong horse. Karen's face remained neutral, but James saw the way her jaw clenched. FBI? She scoffed, forcing a laugh. And what exactly does the FBI have to do with a simple homeowners association? James leaned forward slightly, tapping his fingers on the folder. You tell me, Karen. He let the words hang in the air, watching as a bead of sweat formed at her temple. She recovered quickly, her voice turning sharp. This is ridiculous. If you think intimidation is going to get you out of following the rules, you're mistaken. James chuckled under his breath. Oh, I have no intention of intimidation, just transparency. In fact, I think the entire neighborhood should know exactly how their fees are being used, how complaints mysteriously appear, how certain people seem to be pushed out while others conveniently benefit. The room fell into a dead silence. Karen was trapped, and she knew it. One of the board members, Richard Bowen, the same man James had caught sneaking onto his property, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Karen, maybe we should just hear him out. Karen shot him a glare so sharp it could cut glass. There's nothing to hear. This meeting is over. James smiled. That's fine. I didn't expect you to confess here anyway. He stood, adjusting his jacket. I just wanted to give you a fair warning. Because next time we talk, Karen, it won't be in a community meeting. He turned and walked out, leaving behind a room full of shaken board members and a president, who was finally starting to realize just how badly she had miscalculated. The walls were closing in on her, but James wasn't finished yet. It was time to make his final move. James had built cases against criminals far more dangerous than Karen Whitmore, but there was something deeply satisfying about exposing corruption in his own backyard. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone Karen had bullied, every family she had forced out, every life she had disrupted for her own gain. And now it was time for her empire to crumble. The next HOA meeting was different. Word had spread. More residents than ever packed the small community clubhouse, whispering among themselves, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and anger. Karen sat at the head of the table, her usual air of control cracking at the edges. She knew something was coming. She just didn't know how bad it would be. James stood, holding a thick folder of documents. I think it's time this community knows the truth about its leadership. His voice was steady, loud enough for everyone to hear. For years, Karen Whitmore has used her position not to protect this neighborhood, but to exploit it. She has manipulated regulations, fabricated violations, and imposed fraudulent fines, not for the sake of order, but for profit. Murmurs filled the room, but James wasn't finished. He pulled out the copies of financial records, showing misallocated funds, unexplained transactions, and payments made to shell companies linked back to Karen. Homeowners' fees didn't go to maintenance or community improvements. They went into Karen's pocket. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone in the back muttered, I knew it! James then displayed complaints from previous neighborhoods Karen had managed, each story eerily similar. Families forced to sell, property values manipulated, money siphoned away. This was a pattern, a long-running scheme. He turned to the board members. And you, whether knowingly or not, have enabled this fraud. Karen's face twisted into barely concealed fury. This is slander, she snapped, standing so quickly her chair nearly toppled over. You have no proof. James simply gestured to the folder. Actually, I have all the proof I need, and so does the state attorney's office. The room fell silent. Karen froze. That was the final blow. James had already sent the evidence to law enforcement. It was only a matter of time before they came. Knocking. Then, a voice from the crowd. You threatened to evict my mother for having a flower bed. Another. You fined us for a fence that was already here when we moved in. The anger spread like wildfire. The same people who had once been too afraid to speak now stood together, their voices rising in a wave of fury. Karen had ruled through fear, but that fear was gone. Richard Bowen, the board member James had caught sneaking onto his property, suddenly stood. I didn't know about the money, he stammered, sweating under the pressure. I just followed orders. You knew enough, James said coldly. Karen's face had drained of color. She had lost. The HOA board collapsed right then and there. members resigning on the spot, desperate to distance themselves. Karen tried to regain control, but no one was listening anymore. She wasn't the queen of the neighborhood anymore. She was a criminal, waiting to be prosecuted. As James stepped back, he felt a sense of closure. Justice had finally arrived at the perfect neighborhood. The flashing red and blue lights were a surreal contrast against the neatly trimmed lawns and pristine sidewalks of the neighborhood. James stood at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed, watching as two uniformed officers escorted Karen Whitmore out of the HOA office in handcuffs. Her once carefully curated composure had shattered. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. She didn't look like the ruthless manipulator who had terrorized homeowners for years. She just looked defeated. The charges against her were severe: fraud, embezzlement, illegal property seizures. And thanks to the footage James had captured of her board member trespassing on his property, they even tacked on conspiracy and harassment. The HOA, once her personal empire, had crumbled overnight. The remaining board members had turned on her in a desperate bid to save themselves. It was over. As Karen was loaded into the back of the police car, she turned her head sharply, locking eyes with James. There was no more arrogance, no more veiled threats, just a silent, burning hatred. James met her gaze with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Enjoy your new HOA," he murmured under his breath. "The prison kind." The moment the police car pulled away, the neighborhood erupted. Cheers, laughter, relieved sighs. Karen's reign of terror had officially ended. Neighbors who had once avoided James now approached him, shaking his hand, thanking him. "We should have stood up sooner," one man admitted. Another woman, the elderly widow Karen had tried to evict, wiped a tear from her eye. "You saved my home," she whispered. But the real hero of the night sat beside James, tongue lolling happily, completely oblivious to the role he had played in it all. Rex. Someone started clapping, and before James knew it, the entire crowd was cheering for the German shepherd. "To Rex!" someone shouted. "The best neighbor we've got!" James chuckled as a group of kids ran up, showering the dog with treats and belly rubs. He had been the supposed dangerous one, the excuse Karen had used to start this war. And now, he was the neighborhood's new mascot. As the commotion settled, James took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. It wasn't often that justice was this clean, this satisfying, but for once, the bad guy had lost. The neighborhood was finally free. That night, as he sat on his porch watching Rex doze at his feet, James let himself enjoy the rare taste of victory. No disguises, no undercover work, no loose ends, just peace. Exactly what he had wanted when he moved here. And now, thanks to a corrupt HOA president's greed and a loyal dog who refused to be bullied, he had finally found it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.